timetable. And so to the degree that you're able to do that, it often helps in planning learning activities and assessments to have it down to a kind of second level of learning objective as well. But those are the goals for today. And a couple of my colleagues here to help, Kevin Wilson from Academic Technologies and Jen Black from English, who are co-instructors with me on a program that we do that is now called eCampus Course Design Seminar. Did I get that right? All right. Formerly called Online Teacher Training. Some of you might have heard about it that way. And that's really a course design seminar that we teach online, and a lot of what we're going to be presenting today comes out of the things that we teach in that seminar, and so Jen and Kevin have agreed to participate with me. In fact, they're doing a lot more of this session than I am, so I'll turn it over to them.
So I just got back from a conference early this morning called Computers and Writing, and there was a very active Twitter stream going. In fact, I finally broke down and got a Twitter account, and sometimes the Twitter stream was more interesting than the presentations, which actually was kind of fun, because if you didn't pick the best presentation, then you got what was going on in the other ones through the Twitter stream. And it was so interesting to have these kind of parallel conversations going on. So I guess I'll say feel free to do that if you want to, but hopefully you're still listening. So Eric went over the learning objectives for this session. And basically the learning objectives are for you to understand learning objectives and be able to apply them to your classes, to your teaching, and start creating some effective learning objectives. So one of the things that I did at Computers and Writing is that I had just learned about Socrative. And so in our presentation, we wanted to get a sense of what people's background was coming into the presentation. And so I said, well, I just learned this cool new app, let's try it. And so I just had them take a Socrative quiz about their background as online teachers and what they thought the benefits and pitfalls were. And it was so interesting to me how what they said on that written quiz was different than what I got from the verbal feedback in the class. That many of the most outspoken ones were the ones who loved teaching online, who really felt comfortable with it. And many of the people who weren't talking were the ones who said, I feel very uncomfortable, I'm worried about this. And so I got to interact with them on a couple of different levels. So I'm going to ask you to open up the student's Socrative account, and I'm going to have you come to my classroom. And my room is 47290. So if you open the student Socrative app and come to room 47290. And so Eric had a nice typed out quiz. All I'm going to do is ask you a question out loud and have you answer it. So the question I want you to answer are these questions. What do you think, what are the features of a well-designed course? So in your experience, positive or negative experience, what do you think the features are of a well-designed course? And so you can just type in your short answer and submit it when you've said what you want to say. Okay, so I'm trying to show you some other ways of using Socrative, so I'm not going to put this up and let you see all the answers. What I'm going to tell you is some trends that I see, some patterns in your responses. So one of the things that many of you are saying in your responses is that clarity is an important part of a well-designed course. And clarity meaning that the students have a clear expectation of what is going to happen, how they're going to be graded. One of you said that the syllabus sets forth those expectations, and then the instructor doesn't deviate from those as the course goes on, so that students have a good sense of how to get to where they're going. Some of you talk about a balance between focus and variety, so that the course stays on target, but that it's still fun and interesting for students, and I think that's something that we're all trying to figure out. Some of you talked about the instructor having a clear vision for the course, and that ties in really nicely to the idea of learning objectives. But I think often the way that we teach classes is we think more in terms of how am I going to fill this block of time rather than how am I going to effectively accomplish what I need to. And so going back to learning objectives really helps. And again, I'm sorry to be too autobiographical, but with this presentation that we gave, we had so much information we wanted to get across, and as we were putting the presentation together, it started getting very fragmented. And so knowing that I was going to be talking about this today, I said, whoa, wait a second, let's put together some learning objectives for our presentation, since that's actually a workshop. And that really helped me as a presenter to say, okay, you know what, no, that doesn't fit. No, that doesn't work for what we want to do here. So it was a helpful tool for me, and I think helpful too for the people in our workshop to get a sense of where we were trying to head to by the end. And so a lot of these things that we're going to talk about, clear, measurable objectives. And I like this one. It says a course that builds on what we know and creates a lasting impact for future work. And I know Kevin's going to talk about this with effective learning objectives, but that the learning shouldn't just be within the context of this week. You know, I hope that I'm going to look as far ahead of this longer view of learning objectives. Okay, so in talking about course design, we're talking about what happens before the course begins. And I'm not going to review too many of my past teaching indiscretions of walking into a class and saying, I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to do in class today, but hopefully it will go well. That doesn't always go that well, once in a while. But the idea behind course design, of course, is that this pre-planning happens. That you know the subject matter, which I think happens for most of us well before we enter the classroom. And then the course is designed before it begins, not flying by the seat of your pants. And again, I'm stating the obvious, but I think that we're not always strict with ourselves about making sure we do this. And so that course design happens the bulk of it should happen before the course starts, so that we can spend most of the course interacting with students, putting out fires as they come up, reacting, maybe modifying things as we go, and not having to do that planning. And so some ways to organize, some ideas for course design, and of course there is no magic template that fits all courses. Some ideas would be to structure the course around specific topics. For instance, in my research writing class, I know that I'm going to have students write 3 major papers that focus on 3 major kinds of research writing, and so that's how I've organized my courses around that. But it can also be around topics. I know that, like humanities class that I teach, I have it chronologically based, and so the class is grouped around certain historical eras. And so then, or it could be about, if you're reading 3 major texts in your class, or if you're, anyway, the different ways that is broken down in your head already, and making that transparent to the students so that they can see that. But it can also be organized around specific assignments or experiences that you want the students to have. So thinking about the course in these sort of chunks, and what goes together. And so the focus is, so often in putting together our courses, we are focusing on the content. So that last thing our focus should not be on the content or tasks as we're planning a course. Though it often is. Often we think, okay, we've got to get through all this stuff in this class. I've got to write these 3 papers. Got to make sure we've got this in there. So, okay, I'll group it this way. Instead of taking that step back and saying, okay, wait a second, what do I hope they're going to learn? How is the best way for me to organize this course so that they can learn what they're going to learn? And often that means breaking out of our old strategies for designing courses. Okay, so the model that we're going to use in talking about constructive alignment is taken from Deeping's book, Creating Significant Learning Experiences, which is a great book, I think, for any college teacher to read. I go back to it often. And this idea that there are 3 major parts of a course. There are those learning objectives, which ground everything, and that they are connected to the activities that we do and the assessments. So we know what we want students to learn in the course. We create activities that help them to learn those things, and then we create assessments that measure to what extent they are learning the things that we hope that they are learning. And that you can see from the arrows, of course, that these things are constantly informing each other, that all of them need to be modified to make sure that they come into alignment with each other. And so that's the idea of constructive alignment, that where, I guess I think about a car, like you get your wheels aligned, right, that you want to make sure everything's running smoothly together. And then down here at the bottom, there's situational factors that are affecting every class that is being taught, right? Again, we can't just say, here is the perfect class, teach it this way, because we're different teachers and that sort of thing. So, situational factors. The context of the teaching learning situation. So that can be, am I teaching a once-a-week 4-hour, 3-hour class? Am I teaching 5 days a week for an hour? Am I teaching, now with the fall scheduling, I'm starting to ask myself these questions. Okay, how is my class going to change now that I'm teaching it twice a week on Wednesdays and Fridays as opposed to the 3 times a week I was doing before? So we have that sort of situational factor. Expectations of others, students, but of course administration, our department chairs, the students, I think I said them already, the nature of the subject, in what way is it going to be learned best, characteristics of the specific learners in our classes. So, for instance, I've taught Humanities 208 for many, many years, and in face-to-face classes, it's almost always freshmen and sophomores that take that class. And when I began teaching it online, it was last semester, graduating seniors. Very different population of students, and I had to think about, okay, how am I going to modify the way that I've aligned and structured this class? And then the characteristics of the teacher, of course, right? What are your strengths? What are the ways that you are able to communicate that with the students? So what we'd like for you to do now is to think for a second, and you can write down for yourself, what are some of the situational factors that affect your classes? Or specifically maybe the class that you're creating this worksheet for. What are the things that you have to take into account that are specific to your classes or the students that you're working for? And so think about it for a second, and then I'll tell you the next part. Let's take about a minute to think about your situational factors. Okay, I'm going to ask you to report back, and I want you to tell me, or tell us, one situational factor that your partner has to deal with. So one thing that you've learned that's a situational factor from someone else's class, and maybe something that's not a situational factor. So, volunteers, what did you learn? Yeah, Deborah. Okay, teaching a Saturday morning class. I've taught Saturday morning classes. Lots of situational factors in terms of how do I make them awake? They have busy lives. I might be tired after a long week, so how do I take those into account in my class? Okay, other situational factors. Yeah?
The fear of technology. Anyway, some, but then others who are just like, this is so easy.
Right. Well, and fear of specific different technologies too, right? That some of us might feel like, oh yeah, I'm good, I know PowerPoint really well. But then, oh my gosh, this new technology. So yeah, there's this constant learning curve in technology. Great. Okay, other situational factors. Yeah. Large enrollment. So the size of the class has a huge effect. I'm teaching a 200 plus class in the fall for the first time, and yeah, wow, that's really changing my mind about the kind of objectives and how I achieve those objectives especially. All right, others? Yeah?
Apparently several of us at the table teach groups of students, very different kinds of groups of students. I think they already know what they're going to be learning in the class.
Ah, yeah, so that goes, I mean, that expectation, right? And I face that too, especially in required classes where students say, you know, and I ask them at the beginning of the semester, why are you in this class? Because I have to be, right? End of story. And so then, so part of my job has to be to convince them that there is a reason. Yeah, exactly. Okay, others. Situational factors. Yeah.
So students might be in our graduate program, students are very vocationally focused, more so than maybe in some of our undergraduate courses.
Right, yeah. And so that, again, going along with that expectation, right? How is this going to benefit me? Why am I having to take this specific class? So, yeah, externalizing those expectations. Other thoughts? Hopefully there are more thoughts, and if you're tweeting, maybe tweeting. I don't know. Okay, so, oh, didn't come up very well.
No.
So when you have, you can still hear me, right? I have to come over here so I can point. So you have these three features: the learning objectives, the assessments, and the activities. So I'm going to tell you a sad story from my own teaching experience. So I had a goal that students would be able to look at a work of art or literature or music, and they would be able to put it in a specific historical context. They would look at it and they'd say, I see this is very organized, it's got a lot of emphasis on reason and mathematical setup, so I think this is probably a Renaissance work because I notice it's religious, so I'm kind of, ambitious. And so I told them ahead of time, this is what you're going to have to do on the test. So this is I have a goal for you to be able to do this, you're going to have to do it on the exams, and then they kept bombing the exams. And I was so frustrated. I told them what's on the exam, and I realized there was a big misalignment. I wasn't giving them activities leading up to those exams that were preparing them for that specific task. So although my assessment and my goal were lined up together, they didn't bring in those learning activities. And so as soon as I added in a learning activity that allowed them to practice doing that, the exam scores went right up, surprisingly. So I had that misalignment problem going forward in the class. There it is. So got that. Maybe it comes up here too. Yeah.
Oh,
All right.
magic, yeah.
Magic. Didn't work out that way. It wasn't connected in that way. And I'm not sure, I can't remember where's the misalignment. Okay, here we go. So, another example of a class might be one where you have a learning goal that includes writing, right? And so I want my students to learn how to write. I'm going to have them practice writing a lot. But then the things that they are assessed on, where the scores, you know, especially those big exams, don't incorporate writing, or they're not assessed on their writing. And so there's, again, that disconnect. And I don't know if you've ever had a student say, why are we doing this? Not to say that that's always our fault, but once in a while I think it is, right? That they don't see how this is preparing me for the test, or what this assignment has to do with the goals of the course. And so, again, there's this constant realignment that has to happen to be able to go back and say, all right, I can see that these things fit together. And so the beginning of that is to create effective learning goals. I think that's where it all starts. What do I hope that they will learn? And that's what Kevin's going to talk about now. Yeah.
Thank you, Jen. What I want to do is gradually work our way toward an analysis of what learning objectives are and what constitutes an effective learning objective. But I want to do so kind of gradually by beginning with some key questions at a more global and more abstract level. In thinking about course design, I think it's important to start with some of these questions. What are the learning goals for the course? What kinds of assessment and feedback should I provide? What kind of teaching and learning activities will help achieve the learning goals I get? And then the concept that we have been referring to as constructive alignment are the components integrated, consistent with and supportive of each other. And as I was sitting here looking at this slide in preparation for stepping up here, I realized that we're referring to in the first bulleted item as learning goals. I prefer to use the term learning objectives for the specific documentation that we're talking about. You may have a number of goals, but the terms are used interchangeably often. Learning objectives, learning goals, learning outcomes. I prefer learning objectives as being a little more specific. We all have learning different goals for a course. I want to inspire students. I want to build a community of learners. I want to inspire within them a love of learning and lifelong learning. Those might be goals that I have for the course. Learning objectives is a term you'll often see used interchangeably, or learning outcomes used interchangeably with learning objectives. But we have administratively a term, outcomes, that I think has a different kind of meaning. So we're going to work toward learning objectives, and in particular what might constitute some effective learning objectives. What am I going to do here? There we go. So here's a pocket definition of learning objectives. Learning objectives provide structure and course design. They're a target to shoot for. You know, you might have heard the expression that if you don't know where you're going, any road will do. Learning objectives provide that target for you to shoot for and become then a central starting point for any kind of informed course design. Functionally, there are also statements of expectations that address enduring questions about the course. And in many respects, they hold true for various iterations of the same course, semester to semester, even different sections of the same course may share those same learning objectives because they do address enduring questions about the course. If those are sort of working definitions of what a learning objective is, and more specifically, a learning objective specifies what students should know or be able to do, take a look at this learning objective. What would we have to change to make it fulfill that function as being a specification or documentation of what students should know or be able to do? Global economic, legal, financial, and cultural perspectives on business and marketing.
That's not
That's not even a sentence. So that might be a good place to start with a subject, verb, and an object.
Yeah. Define,
Synthesize?
describe.
Synthesize.
Students will synthesize.
There's no action in that.
In an essay, students will synthesize global, economic, legal, financial, and cultural perspectives.
That's getting started toward something that's more meaningful and specific to documents what a student will know or be able to do. This is more of a catalog entry describing the content of the course, but it certainly doesn't give us a goal to shoot for. Start there, and you're back to what Jen suggested. How do I fill this hour and a half of time, rather than how do I meet a particular goal? How do I cover this content, rather than meet a particular learning objective?
One other thing that I noticed about this learning objective from a student perspective is that I would stress out, even if it said identify or synthesize, oh my gosh, global, economic, legal, cultural, financial perspectives, and business and marketing.
All in the same 5 paragraphs?
Yeah. So I think that, I mean, there's nothing wrong with breaking things down or having, separating things out, even if we see them as connected, that we don't have to lump them all together.
Yeah, I suspect that there are a dozen learning objectives masquerading or hidden behind this statement here. How are we doing on time? We're okay. Why don't you, among yourselves, think for a minute, create a short list of characteristics of what might constitute an effective or exemplary learning objective. I'll put back up here.
All right.
Okay, well, thank you for, it's interesting how much alignment there is, I guess, overlap that there is between the different things that you said. Most of you said, and this is kind of what we think as well, that good learning objectives are specific. Now, specificity alone is not enough, right? You could be very specific about a bad learning objective, but it's a good starting place to be able to say, okay, this is what, so rather than saying, you'll know stuff, you wouldn't say that, but sometimes that's how it comes across to students, right? Especially depending on the kinds of words that we use. Yeah, understand is a kind of slippery word to use in learning objectives because, and it goes along with that, measurable. I mean, it's hard to measure exactly what people understand. So specific, measurable, a lot of you talked about clear, and I think that has to do with that language, and that especially knowing what level your students are at, so that you're able to express those learning objectives in a language that's familiar to them, and attainable. And I think it's interesting, one of you put that learning objectives should be aspirational as well, and I think that's an interesting thing to balance against attainable, right? I could certainly create some attainable learning objectives for my class that would not force my students to actually learn anything. And along this third one, they describe meaningful learning, and some of you talked about this a little bit, saying that they will focus on what the learner will master or understand at the conclusion of a lesson or a class. And I think about this, one thing that I've noticed from looking at a lot of learning objectives from a lot of courses is that often we create learning objectives that are specific, measurable, attainable, like by the end of this class, you will have passed all the exams. Specific, it's attainable, it's measurable, but who cares after this class is over whether they passed my exams? That's no learning going on there. So it's really easy to set up these learning objectives for ourselves that are that fit almost all these things, but aren't focused on the students and what the students should be taking away from this course, not what they're going to be doing as part of my class. Can they write an essay that I like? Well, that's not going to matter once the class is over. So it's meaningful learning that they're going to carry with them as they leave into their lives, hopefully, beyond this class.
Another way to think about describing meaningful learning. How many of you have seen the Saturday Night Live skit from 100 years ago with Father Guido Sarducci and the 5-Minute University? The 5-Minute University, Father Guido Sarducci starts his university and he's going to, in exchange for dollars, give you a college degree after about 5 minutes of study. Because his college degree is aimed at what you remember about college or your field of study 5 years after you graduate. You have a Master's of Business Administration, buy low, sell high. That's what you remember. And it's not a bad way to think about the difference between describing meaningful learning and describing an activity, for instance, is what do you want students to be able to know or be able to do 3, 4, 5 years after your class. And it isn't pass the quiz. It's a deeper, more meaningful understanding of whatever the content is being assessed, being measured on that quiz. Here's a couple of learning objectives that I think stack up against that list that we just generated that hold up pretty well. Critique and analyze works from the humanities in light of the original cultural context and the new context in which they've been interpreted over time. Outside of the class and outside of the context of the class, this might at first blush look still somewhat vague, but I think that given the context of the course and what students know about the subject so far, they've been given an awful lot of detail. In particular, they're being asked to critique and analyze, but in a particular way, in a very specific way, by looking at these works from the original cultural context and from the new cultural context in which they have been interpreted. Another example of what I think is an effective learning objective. Identify experts in the field of OBGYN, sonography, and their views about the changing role of sonography in obstetrics and gynecology. Again, a very specific statement, a measurable objective, something that's attainable, and that meets all of, I think, those items that we saw listed earlier. Questions or comments about any of this so far? On the other hand, here's 4 objectives that I think could benefit from some revision. Let's take them one at a time. Demonstrate an understanding of the basic language of visual art. What problems might that present for students as a learning objective?
How can that understanding be demonstrated?
Okay? It's not measurable, or it doesn't define the manner in which this understanding is going to be measured, or be demonstrated rather. It's very difficult to prove that you understand something if you're not given some specific guidelines or how you're going to show that understanding or demonstrate. How about the next one? Analyze therapeutic drugs of the peripheral and central nervous system.
How are we going to analyze them?
In what fashion? How are you going to analyze it? It's also pretty broad category of items to analyze. I mean, here's one that probably needs to be broken down into perhaps the peripheral nervous system, the central nervous system, or even further to a certain category of therapeutic drugs, those that have certain effects and those that have other effects. Are we going to compare and contrast? Are we going to analyze their effectiveness, their safety, and in what fashion are we going to analyze these drugs? So it's a broad category and it's vague instruction to the students. Eric, what was the learning objective similar to this one?
You don't have to go beyond the activity here.
Oh, okay. I won't step all over your punchline. Oh, okay. Demonstrate knowledge of textbook and lecture materials through course quizzes and exams. Not which parts of the textbook?
Has no purpose.
It's not meaningful.
It is kind of a snake eating its tail, isn't it? It's circular logic, and I think it really at the base, you come back down to it, it says, know stuff, pass tests. And that's at the heart of this learning objective. How about the last one? What problems might it pose, both for the instructor and the student? Appropriate for what? Yes, appropriate for what purpose? I'm sorry?
Select the instrument and do what with it?
Select the instrument and then do what with it? What if it's a 200 level class? A 100 level class? The language that the jargon intrudes and your students may not be conversant, they may not have picked up on the discipline-specific language, they may not understand what some of these multisyllabic words mean. Other comments, questions about these objectives? Zooming back out to the more abstract and more generalized again. As you think about course design, as you work toward learning objectives, it's helpful to think about different frameworks, different ways of learning, different ways of knowing, different frameworks to be adopted, adapted, or merged in your particular course and in your particular approach to course design. How can you frame what you want students to know or be able to do by the end of the course? One one type of frame, or one frame you may be familiar with, is Bloom's taxonomy of learning objectives, broken into 3 general domains: cognitive, psychomotor, and affective, and all measured in different ways, all assessed in a different fashion, all involving different skills or different ways of knowing and ways of learning. I had a worksheet for us to work with that I'm going to skip in the interest of time here. It and other information about Bloom's taxonomy is available in the session page on the Institute website, so you can download some of those resources from there. But I think we'll just move past that exercise because I think we'll have a more fruitful outcome with the one that remains in this session. I want to mention just in passing that as we talk about learning objectives, that it's important to make a distinction between course level learning objectives and module level learning objectives. I recommend that you have both, so that you're not flying by the seat of your pants at that module level. A module might be a week's worth of instruction. It might be a set of related topics that have been grouped together. It might be chapters in a textbook that comprise a module. It might be tied to achievements or activities. For instance, a proposal that culminates in a research project and culminates in a research report at the end of the semester may be another way of organizing activities and assessments aimed at specific module level learning objectives. I think quite often we start thinking about learning objectives as course level learning objectives, those outcomes at the end of the course, but it's equally important to think of the level of the module, whether that's a week, a chapter, a set of related topics, however you've divided your content and your activities. We've already noted some of these by looking at a few of the objectives that could use some revision. Common pitfalls is that it's not measurable. Understand, appreciate the distinctions in one type of art from another doesn't really give us anything by which to measure the students' progress toward that goal. We've noted the use of jargon and familiar language that falls outside of the discipline or that students haven't yet learned or adopted. Often the fault lies with a learning objective that describes what students are doing rather than what they should know or be able to do as a result of that learning activity. So you'll often see this in surprising places, written by people who should know better, where a learning objective does all of those things. It's specific and it's measurable, but it really describes a learning activity rather than the outcome of that learning activity or the goal toward which that activity is headed. Handout time.
All right, so the activity that we're going to do next, I've got, and you can find this in your Dropbox. If you go to the Summer Institute 2012 folder, and then the folder Day 1 Introduction, there is a file in there called LO Critique Activity, or something similar to that. It's a dot. If you open that up, you'll have 8 learning objectives. I've also got, for those of you who appreciate or recognize the incredible irony of using dead trees in a mobile learning institute, but yet you still prefer paper, I've got some of that, so I'll go around and put them on the table.